Alright, so I figured I'd make a video on how to do team building within Gems of War. Something that I see people posting a lot on the forums or asking in guild chat is, how do you make a team? What are you considering as you go to make a team? So I figured I'd show you some of my teams and generally what I'm trying to do when I'm throwing together a team for Gems of War. I'll caveat this by saying that it's very different how you try and make a team for PvP or Guild Wars versus something like an event. Event team building is very different than PvP team building, so I will go over PvP here, and then I can potentially cover events in another video. So, if we jump into the teams that I've got set up, I'll look at this Titan team for instance. So when it comes to team building, something that you're always trying to think about is speed, mana generation, looping, damage, and potentially utility, depending on what you're trying to create here. So if we look at this team that I have, let's start with the top requirement here, which is speed. Speed is something that you're going to get from a hero like Gimlet. When you see these troops that are empowered like this, that start with full mana, and they do this mana conversion property, turning all green to brown, you can immediately transform the board into your preference. So in this case, I'm trying to convert a bunch of green gems to brown, which will then fill up Glaceon. If we jump over to Glaceon, we'll see that he also does the same thing. He can transform yellow gems to blue, and then he also does a crap ton of damage on top of it. So immediately we have speed just because we have one of these empowered troops that comes with this conversion capability. Mana generation is also coming immediately as part of this, again because of the gem conversions that are part of the troop abilities. The next thing that we'd want to consider is looping. So when it comes to having these empowered troops, something that you always want to keep in mind is that you want to try and only use these when there's an actual 4 or 5 match that can be made when you shoot off their spell ability. So you don't want to just be using them casually. The AI, when the computer uses these kinds of teams, will just shoot them off regardless of what's on the board. What you want to make sure you're doing is using these intelligently. So with Glaceon, you want to be making sure that yellow and blues are matching, or skulls and reds are matching. And then you can use the ability knowing that it's still going to be your turn. And then the next thing you want to consider is damage. So speed is extremely important. How can I start doing damage as quickly as I possibly can? And how can I make sure that it's never not my turn? That's basically the way I always try and approach my team building. So Gimlet, he can turn things into brown. Glaceon turns stuff into blue and does damage on top of it. And then we have this other thing, Doomblade, which is more or less a Glaceon type troop, only instead of the gem conversion piece, he just does the reds to Doomskulls. So, and he also does damage to everybody else here. So my damage is coming from top troop and my second troop. I have mana generation coming in the form of this troop and this troop. And then Possessed King, who is actually my favorite troop, what he ends up is being used for is this unstable possession ability. Really what this is all about is that every time you make a 4 or 5 match, you get a lot of explosions on the board to go on top of it. So the moment you do a 4 or 5 match, the entire board jumbles around, and next thing you know, you're doing a ton of mana generation, all of your troops will be full. It also sets up the board very nicely for other 4 or 5 matches to be used at a later time. So this is an example of how you get speed with a troop like Gimlet, mana generation with Glaceon and Gimlet, and the explosions from Possessed King. Looping capability because you can choose when to use these spells and when you can get those extra turns. And damage, of course, because this is doing damage to all troops on top of doing Doomskull transformations, as well as Glaceon is also doing Doomskull transformations. So these 2 troops are my damage. These 2 troops are essentially my mana generation, with Glaceon also serving as mana generation on top of it. The last piece is utility. This team's utility is coming from Glaceon and the weapon here. So Glaceon you'll notice, also freezes the strongest enemy. So it's not always going to be the first troop in the lineup, but you will get a freeze as a result of using Glaceon's core ability. With Doomblade, you also get a freeze. It's less obvious, but when you jump into over here, you'll notice that it has this frozen property, which means every time that I use Doomblade, I'm actually freezing the first enemy as well. So regardless of what class I'm using here, I'm going to have 2 things that are freezing. So this team is an example of a really good team because you're getting mana generation, you're getting speed, you're getting tons of damage, you're controlling the board completely. So this is an example of what you want to do when you're thinking of team building. When I went to go make this team, what I was really trying to do was build a team around this Doomblade weapon, and I saw that it was a straight blue weapon. So I figured, okay, this is a straight blue weapon. What kinds of these empowered converters am I going to be able to use to get this Doomblade filled? So when you think about blue, there's a troop called Scurvy Dog. So if you do this sort by empowered, and then you do the spell effect of convert gems, you'll see all these fun people. Scurvy Dog is the one who actually does the blue conversion. But blue conversion in and of itself to get Doomblade isn't super great, because if I had this troop in the first slot, for instance, and I used Scurvy Dog to give him his mana, he's not really set up to take damage back. So with Titan class that I'm using for this team, for instance, they obviously get barriers on browns. If I'm using a blue weapon, it's not ideal to be having this troop in the top of my lineup unless I'm somehow getting brown gems by default. So since this is a blue weapon, I decided I need somebody else in my top slot who ideally could take skull damage in return, and lo and behold, here's Glaceon. When what's great about him is not only does he have ability to take skull damage back, but he actually turns yellows to blues. So now I have a person that is brown mana, I have a troop that can empower it and get it brown mana right away, and then I have Glaceon able to get my Doomblade mana right away. And normally I would not try and do something where I have a troop that's making red into Doomskulls and then a weapon that's also turning red into Doomskulls. But that's where someone like Possessed King comes into play. The moment I use someone like Glaceon, the entire board is going to jumble up all over the place, and you're not going to have this problem where the entire board is now removed of any red gems because you've just used Glaceon. There's going to be a ton of explosions, a ton of bouncing gems, and you're going to have a very good opportunity of getting another Doomblade cast off. So when it comes to team building, this is something you really want to think about. So let's look at another team that I've got set up here. So this is the Sunspear class. This is really my favorite class that's in the game. I think it's just perfect all across the board. I won't gush about it too much in this video since that's not the purpose. But just looking at the team, you can probably get a sense of why this is a kind of a lineup that is a very good team to use. So it's got all the standard things, speed, right? So here's this empowered troop, can immediately turn all browns to reds. That's great. So immediately I can get a bunch of red gems. Sunspear, as you may know, there's always a Firestorm every single turn, and you also get bonus mana from reds just as a class talent. So from there, you're already looking at a ton of red mana just by one cast of Taipan. The first red troop that's going to get that mana is Infernus, and of course everyone is very likely familiar with Infernus. Infernus will explode the board when you cast him, so you're getting some loop potential, extra turn potential out of his core ability on top of the damage he's doing. The other thing that is kind of a sneaky thing about this build, which is more of a utility item, is this Conflagration, so you'll burn all enemies on 4-5. Infernus and Sunspear go together like peanut butter and jelly, essentially. Your hero will do triple damage to people that are burning as a result of this Fireblade. You'll see it does triple skull damage to burning enemies. So what that really means is that all I have to do is a single 4-match, and now my hero, anytime I match a skull, is going to be doing triple damage, which is disgusting. Infernus already does a solid amount of damage by himself. You'll see Obsidius also does solid damage by himself, but on top of that, now I also have triple skull damage in play, which is kind of disgusting. So I have loop potential here with Infernus, which is great. And since he explodes gems, I also have more mana generation coming out of Infernus. Obsidius, what's nice about him is that you're destroying a 5x5 block, and what you'll note about destroy, as it says up here, you're getting the full effect of those gems. So that entire 25 gem block, you're going to get 100% of that mana or skull damage that you're actually taking in that block. So that's really strong mana generation just in and of that. And since we're running a Sunspear in this instance, you're also going to be raining down more red gems as a result. So every single one of these troops in this lineup is mana generation. The Sky Hero weapon, for instance, For every yellow in a column, you're creating 4 red gems. So this item is purely utility, purely mana generation. It also has some minor utility in like breaking barriers and things like that, but for the most part, you're using this for mana generation. So every single troop that I have in this lineup can loop. This person can loop because it's converting. This person can loop because it's exploding. This person can loop because it's destroying a big 25 gem block. This can also loop because I'm creating gems as a result of the cast. So it's entirely possible that on turn 1 I can completely win the game as long as there's some setup with Taipan. And if there's not a setup with Taipan, I have another way of generating mana with the Sky Hero weapon. So this is another example of a good team where damage output is there, speed is there, mana generation is there. There's even some utility in there with stuns coming from Obsidious, with triple damage, and the Sky Hero with the Sunspear weapon, that is, and tons of loop potential here. So when you're going to make your teams, again, think of a troop that you really want to build around. In this case, I was building more around the idea of a Sunspear class, knowing that I was going to be raining down red mana constantly, and knowing that I get triple damage from burning. So if you play Sunspear at level 100, you'll know that Infernus is more or less your best friend because you can more or less guarantee that they're burning all of the time. So if I'm going to use Infernus in a build, I'm going to see who I can pair him up with to try and do as much damage as I possibly can, knowing that everyone's going to be burning, knowing I'll get that triple skull damage. A variant of this build is also using someone like Divine Ishbala. With her, she'll just create skulls on the board, so she's another conversion type troop that's also going to be making mana that feeds Infernus, also creating skulls. So combined with Infernus and Queen Ishbala, your hero is also going to be doing triple skull damage, and there's going to be a plentiful amount of skulls to do it with. So that's really what you need to think about when it comes to team building. You know, what are the troops that I'm trying to build around, and how can I get them mana as quickly as possible, and how can I make sure that I never give up my turn? That's really all it takes to make a good team. Obviously, when you have a lot more mythics, this is a little more interesting to do if you're really going to have to scrap around to figure out what kind of teams you can build around. It's still entirely possible. The nice thing is that all of these empowered converters that are on display here, they're not very high level troops. I think Epic is about the level that all of them are at. So with that in mind, it's extremely easy to get these kinds of troops. Make sure you get their final trait, which is this empowered trait, and then from there you're going to have the speed characteristic of team building already covered just by having a single one of these in the lineup. So hopefully you found that interesting, useful. If you have any feedback, questions, let me know. Otherwise, this is Keylime signing off. Thanks, guys.